Welcome to Deep Dive MH370. Hello everyone, I'm Andy Tarnoff, the publisher of On Milwaukee, and I'm joined by Jeff Wise, aviation journalist, and we are on to episode 10, The Vulnerability. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks, Andy. I can't believe we've done 10 episodes. That seems like a lot.
It's moving fast, isn't it?
I think it feels like it's moving fast. I hope it seems like it's moving fast.
Yeah, again, like some people are saying we're moving too quickly. Some people are saying we're moving too slowly. We think we're doing it at the right pace, but we're always open to feedback on that. And today is a doozy. I got to stop saying that at the beginning of each episode because for real. This is the big one. No, I'm just kidding.
It's going up exponentially.
It's oh boy, this one's a lot.
This is a big one. I mean, this is definitely the most controversial one, and I'm a little bit. I just want people to be aware that what we're going to be talking about today is something that is considered very controversial. It even makes some people angry. So I want to really emphasize this is we're talking about an interpretation of events. We're not claiming that this is necessarily true, but it's a possibility that we're gonna talk about. And so people just have to listen along and judge for yourself. We're not going to take the entire show down this particular alley, but there are aspects of this case that are very mysterious, and we're going to have to just talk about them.
So this is not your theory. This is not my theory. We're not getting there yet. But what we are going to do, starting now, is we are going to talk about some things that you discovered along your journey, and then we're going to provide some background about historical precedents for this kind of stuff, and we're going to kind of set the table to really get into it. The reason we're calling this episode The Vulnerability is because we're asking ourselves if there was a vulnerability that could have been exploited to answer some of these previously unexplainable questions. When nothing else seems to make sense, you look at something else. So tell me, because back in episode 7, we talked about how BFO data worked. It showed that the plane went south, but you made an apology, but something didn't sit right with you.
Yeah. Well, I initially, of course, had gone out on a limb and said, it seems to me like the plane went north. And that turned out to be wrong. The BFO data unequivocally said that the plane went south. Okay, the math is a little bit complicated. I think we walked listeners through it on an earlier episode. But once you understand how the math works, it's very unequivocal. The plane, in order to have created the data that it sent back to Inmarsat, it must have been traveling to the south. And so once I realized that, I said, okay, this is what it means. I was wrong to think that it went south. But as the story continued to unfold, strange revelations occurred, which taken together raised new questions. Now, once again, with the touchstone that I'll keep coming back to with MH370 is that this is a deeply strange case. Again and again, things happen that it's very difficult to explain, and that either were a result of an incredible coincidence or string of coincidences, or someone or something did something very odd, very unusual. Now, remember, this is the case that nothing like this has ever happened before.
I mean, it's all weird, right? It's all mysterious, but the fact that the SDU had been turned off and then turned back on again, that is something that investigators believe, like that one is not so much in question, insofar as nothing is not in question, but short of UFOs. But that is a thing that is super duper weird.
We didn't find out about it until a couple months after the plane disappeared, when the authorities released a report that mentioned that the only really plausible way to explain the pattern of signals that had been received was that somebody had powered it off somehow. This box had been powered down and then powered back up again. It remains highly contentious to this day, highly contentious, as to how this could have happened, whether it's something that a pilot would do or that very few pilots would know how to do or be motivated to do. Even if you look now in the comments of our page today, if you look at what's happening on Twitter as people are discussing our podcast, people get very angry even at the suggestion that there's something really weird about this. But you talk to pilots, and a lot of pilots cannot really explain how this happened. So this is the one. Okay, let's talk about a bunch of things happening, which together made me wonder if there was something else very different happening about this case. Number one, the SDU getting rebooted.
So first of all, your former colleagues in the independent group, they said there's a simple answer to this. They said that they wanted to make sure that nobody from the cabin or the passengers could use the sat phone to call for help. But and that would have done the trick, right? But that's not the only way, and that's not the easy way. That's not like the way you turn off the phones.
Well, people have come up with various explanations for why somebody might have wanted to reboot the SDU, and I think we talked about this in an earlier episode. One of them is that somebody wanted to save power from the engine, so turned off the entire electrical system. Another more recently mooted idea was that somebody wanted to prevent someone from using the SATCOM. That there's a handset in the cabin, and so they turned off half the electrical system in order to prevent that from happening. But there's simpler ways to disable the
okay,
the phone
but
system,
nonetheless,
so
that was the first thing that you're like, that's a weird thing.
When that information was released, it told us that we had made a wrong assumption, because everybody had assumed that this system had just inadvertently been left on. Okay, so now that what would have been a very simple to understand explanation suddenly becomes hard to understand. This is another case of MH370, upsetting expectations and violating expectations. Okay, but that wasn't the only thing. Then some other things happened as well that seemed odd. One was a revelation that it turns out that in a 777, that all of the electronics that run the airplane, that run the flight controls, that run the communications, everything is inside a compartment that is accessible from the cabin. All right, so you can pull back a carpet.
Yeah.
And go
So
down into this thing.
let's just pause here, just for the little reset here, because we haven't yet really talked about this. I mean, people who watch the Netflix special or documentary know that, but again, this is not speculation. And at the time of MH370's flight, one could literally go into the first class passenger section, pull up a piece of carpet, and crawl down into the belly of the plane. That's a thing. That's a real thing.
And it's true. And shortly before the plane disappeared, actually, an airline pilot had written a paper explaining that this vulnerability existed, and he worried that it could be exploited, that somebody with nefarious intent could get down into the electronics bay and have in front of them all of the boxes, all of the computers that do everything on a plane.
You're talking about Matt Wilhelmine? A former Australian.
I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his name.
Apologies to Matt. So he's a former Australian 777 pilot. He talked about, he has a master's thesis on this that he put out in June 2013.
And so he was already where he was trying to sound the alarm that it's possible to get in. Okay, but that doesn't really directly relate to the issue that the box had been rebooted. But it was just a fact that had become floating around. And then another piece of the puzzle was Mike Exner explained to me. So I was like, well, how? So everything hinges on this BFO data. How does this BFO data get generated? We talked about that in a previous episode. But where does the SDU get the data that it uses to make the calculation? Yeah. It needs to know where it is and how the plane is moving relative to the satellite to do this Doppler precompensation, to change the frequency.
Yes.
How does it know where it is and how fast it's moving? And Mike Exner, one of the independent group members, explained to me, and I vividly remember where I was standing when he told me this over the phone.
What did he say?
The information comes from the electronics bay. It comes from a box called the IRS, the Inertial Reference System. And this is a system that combines information from GPS and inertial guidance systems. And it basically, it's the plane's idea of where it is and how it's moving.
Just to clarify, this box, this computer, this server, this area in 2014 was in an unlocked, unsecured section underneath some carpeting in the first class section. Right. Hypothetically, anyone who knew where it was could pull up that carpet and walk down the stairs. They'd probably get in trouble, but you could do it.
Okay, exactly. And so as mid-2014 rolls around, the authorities are getting ready to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in this very ambitious and sophisticated search of the Southern Ocean. They're going to go to this remote patch, which is three miles deep, and there's like mountains down there and crevices and stuff. And they're going to scan using sonar this pretty huge area of seabed in order to find the plane. And so as they're getting ready to do that, the question I'm asking myself is there any other possible way? And let me emphasize and put in italics the word possible. Is there any conceivable way that this data could have been generated other than what the authorities are assuming? Okay? And now, because of these pieces of information that have been floating around separately, put them all together, and what do you get? You have a situation in which anybody could theoretically access the electronics bay where the box is that generates the position and navigational information that gets sent to the SDU that it uses to perform the calculation.
So what's happening here is we're talking about fly-by-wire, and it's not that different than the concept of drive-by-wire. It's in certain modern cars, planes, when you know, in a car, if you turn the steering in a Prius or a Tesla or something, it's not doing what old-timey cars used to do. It's a computer generated response as opposed to,
right.
I'm not a automotive expert, but it's not moving the axles and turning the wheels, right? So just like on a plane, it's not like an old plane that has mechanical levers. My motorcycle is drive-by-wire. I mean, it does things. It does things differently than older planes.
Right. When I ride my bicycle, when I turn my handlebars on my bicycle, I'm actually moving a piece of metal that's directly connected to the wheel, and that makes the whole bike turn. And cars used to be made like that. My car probably still is. I don't drive a Tesla.
Nor do I.
But I went flying, was it yesterday, the day before, and I was in a Cherokee, Piper Cherokee from like probably the 70s. And yeah, when I pull back on the controls, it's connected to a cable that's physically connected to the tail. And so you have a direct mechanical linkage. The 777 was the first plane that Boeing built that was completely fly-by-wire. It was an all-electric plane. So when you move the controls in the 777, you're actually sending a electric signal to a computer that is then interpreting what you want and then translating it into signals that get sent to an actuator that moves the control surfaces. So the reason you bring this up quite perspicaciously is that if you're in the electronics bay of the 777, you have total control of that airplane. Or you have maybe if you're smart and you know how to hack a computer, you have the means to do everything that happens from that plane comes out of that electronics bay.
I watched the documentary before I met you, and that's what got me into this whole thing. There was a statement by Mike Exner that said, "Yeah, that can't be done," and then he left it at that. So
what we're basically proposing in this episode, the gist of what we're saying in episode 10 right now, is that there appears to have been a vulnerability or a backdoor, depending on what you want to call it. There was a vulnerability by which it's possible. Now, whether or not it was taken advantage of or not is a separate issue. But what we're asking in this episode was there a vulnerability by which it becomes less than 100% certain that the BFO data that indicates that the plane went into the Southern Indian Ocean was correct, was not in fact tampered with? So, is it impossible? No.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's not likely. It's never been done before. But we're just putting out the theory here that we don't know if such a vulnerability exists. It may not.
But is it possible that it exists? Now, there's ways to say, no, it can't exist because X. Because there's a whole chain of things that has to be true in order for this idea to work.
A ton of things.
Like if this was a 767, an older generation of Boeing, this idea wouldn't work because you cannot take over a 767 just by taking over the electronics bay, because there are mechanical linkages that a person in the cockpit can do that you can't do anything about in the electronics bay. Okay. Right. Now, one possible fault with this idea is that you cannot take over the control surfaces of a 777 from the electronics bay. And as you say, Andy, in the Netflix documentary,
a Malaysia Airlines employee is on camera saying you cannot control a 777 from the electronics bay.
Anyone who gets into the hatch can disable the transponder and disable the communication systems. But it is impossible to fly the aircraft from the avionics compartment. It is impossible.
We mentioned the influential Atlantic article that William Langevisha wrote. In that article, he actually says something along the lines of, you can't control a 777 from the electronics bay for reasons that are too numerous for me to mention.
Well, that's no fun.
I thought that was kind of funny because I'm like, I would love to hear your even one fraction of one. You don't have to go on for pages. Just give me a hint. As far as I know, no one has given a reason and then documented that reason. Mike has not told me how he knows. No, Boeing has not said. Boeing, to be fair, Boeing is rather.
I wouldn't
secretive
tell if I was
about how its
Boeing
planes
either.
work.
I mean, that's not something that you want to know. Oh, here's our exploit, but.
But let me give you some possible reasons for why this wouldn't work. Right? If this was an Airbus plane,
Wouldn't work.
In Airbus planes, and half the planes made today are Airbus. In an Airbus, the hatch into the electronics bay is in the cockpit.
That makes sense to me.
So only the flight crew can get into it. Okay, so this whole idea wouldn't have worked if it was an Airbus and not a Boeing. Okay.
Can I just ask why Boeing would have put it there? I mean, this plane was built after 9/11, wasn't it? I mean,
I literally have no idea. No, it was designed before 9/11. It's a plane from the 90s.
okay. So perhaps they just didn't anticipate what an unbelievably ridiculous security risk that would be. But
There's
okay,
so much
all right,
we
okay.
can
So anyway,
anticipate
so
from
the
this.
Airbus plane, the only way to access that area is through the cockpit.
Okay. So it couldn't be this wouldn't work with an Airbus. It wouldn't work with any plane older than a 777. It wouldn't work with a 757, a 747, a 767. It probably would work with a 787. I don't really know. At this time, there really weren't that many 787s. So,
but the fact is, it worked with this plane, and it didn't work with other
it
planes.
also wouldn't have worked with any with any airline that was paying for the full priced version of Inmarsat. It only because most airlines, or I don't know how many airlines pay, but Inmarsat has a higher level. It's like when you have Netflix that doesn't have ads.
Yeah, and we talked. We
does
spent a
have
whole
ads.
episode talking about this, but nonetheless, I mean, yes, all these things would have had to line up because the classic Arrow system was the one that wouldn't have generated or allowed the mathematicians at Inmarsat to generate these ping rings and figure this information out. They would have just simply had the information where it went, how it went, what.
Right.
But it didn't.
Right. And also remember, we have also talked about how it has to be a box from Thales and not Rockwell.
Yes.
Because of the way that the pre-compensation works.
So again, the aging satellite with the wobbliness and it's like a lot of things are lining up.
Also, the mathematicians, so this is another thing. This whole idea that somebody might have accessed this box and made it, and so the gist of the idea is that there's a way that you could, because of this existence of this backdoor, this vulnerability, there is a way that if you were super sophisticated and nefarious and clever and aggressive, you could take this plane and alter the BFO data to make it look like the plane was going south when it was really going north. This is the statement that drives my critics absolutely crazy.
And yeah, I mean, of course, they think it's preposterous, and
it makes them mad.
I've seen the anger.
It makes them really mad.
I've seen how aggressively they respond to you.
The question is whether somebody could have made a false trail of electronic breadcrumbs to mislead investigators, right? But this idea would only work if there was a whole daisy chain of things about this flight. But it turns out that all of those things are true. And so if we're proposing that it's possible to take planes of a certain kind and create this false trail, it's very rare. Maybe this is the only flight in the world that passes all of these requirements. There's one more requirement I just want to throw in there, because this method only discriminates northern routes and southern moving routes. It doesn't discriminate east-west routes. Some people have even now speculate that this plane was being hijacked to like Mecca or something, some kind of an Islamicist plot. This data couldn't discriminate east-west like that. Okay. This particular vulnerability we're proposing is a very, very specific, We're not, because there's people who've come forward and say, oh, the Americans don't like China, so they shot it down. Or, you know, maybe somebody was trying to, maybe it wasn't mangosteens in the cabin, in the cargo hold. Maybe it was gold and they wanted to steal it. Those kind of very vague ideas about, you know, nefarious intent and hijacking, they're very vague. And so if people who dismiss them as conspiracy theorists have something to say, because it's just a very vague notion. We're making a very, very specific observation here. And we're not saying it necessarily happened, but we're saying it appears that this whole chain of seeming coincidences add up to a particular vulnerability that only this plane had, and that it could have allowed someone to do this thing that we're proposing that makes people mad.
All right, Jeff, I am not even going to let us go there yet, because now you're starting to talk about things that we haven't even introduced to the audience yet. And I don't think we're at the spot yet where we talk about the likelihood of this until we talk about the theory and concept of hacking. And this is where I'm going to nerd out just a little bit. And we may devote an entire episode to this, but I want to talk a little bit about what this means, how people are familiar with it, what people think is preposterous, and things that have actually happened that people think are preposterous, and what's possible and what isn't. Because if you don't buy into or accept that stuff, then what you're talking about right now is unfathomable. Yet hacking is not a new concept. It's been happening for a long time. I did a little bit of research on this. You know, in World War II, you know, we had the Enigma machine. That is definitely not the kind of hacking that we're talking about, but I mean, it changed the course of World War II.
But it's a kind of hacking in the same sense that, like, somebody figured out how a system worked so that they could subvert it.
Exactly. So there are a bunch of other examples, high-tech, low-tech ones. You know, there's the Fancy Bear DNC hack in the Clinton, the Trump race.
Right.
You know, some of this stuff is as simple as phishing or brute force, you know, all sorts of stuff. But then it gets to the point where every time I hear you talk to me offline about where this is, about what you think might have happened, one specific example keeps coming back to me over and over again. And I'm wondering if you remember in 2015, the San Bernardino workplace shooting. Remember that happening?
Right. I do.
So that was a guy whose name was Saeed Rizwan, and I think he killed 14 people, and the FBI wanted his iPhone.
This was an Islamic couple.
Yeah,
Muslim.
yeah, and the FBI wanted to see what was going on, and his phone was locked. It was running iOS 9. Now, this is not like the first iPhone here. I mean, this was many generations. This is the ninth, iOS 9. This is the ninth generation of this stuff. But Apple said very, very loudly and clearly that their phones were unhackable, and the FBI said, "Tough,
Right.
do it anyway."
This is the modern equivalent of the Enigma machine.
Yeah, like
state of the art, most modern encryption.
Apple said.
It cannot
Apple
be
said,
hacked.
not only can it not be hacked by you, it can't be hacked by us. If you're asking us to build a workaround to break into our phone, not only could we not do it, but even if we did do it, we'd be making our phones less sophisticated. It can't be done. So, they're trying to get this court order, the FBI is, and Apple's pushing back as they do. That's their line. All phones can be hacked except for the iPhone. Well, so the FBI goes to this Australian company.
All roads lead to Australia. They're the North Pole of all conspiracies.
So they go to Australia, this Australian company called Azimuth Security, and they say, hack it for us. And they get two guys for $900,000. And I'm going to try to explain this, but basically they find this they get the phone in their possession, and they find this exploit through the Mozilla browser operating system or browser, and using the Lightning port on the iPhone, they basically apply two more exploits, and then they have control over the phone, and they crack it.
Which was believed impossible.
It was believed impossible. FBI says, okay, good, we've got what we need, thanks.
Because it's so lucrative. If you can figure out to find an exploit, It's people will pay you good money to like do the impossible.
Yeah.
basically.
So they called it Condor, and it's
They called the exploit
yeah.
Condor.
And there are all sorts of different kinds
Operation
of
Condor.
there are all sorts of different kinds of hacking things. This one I would consider a 0-day exploit, which basically means getting into software or hardware before the developers realize that it's hackable, because after they do,
Right.
they
0 day.
0 day, exactly. It's a window of vulnerability.
0 day means how many days have elapsed between the developer being aware of a vulnerability and the hacker taking advantage of it. In this case, it's 0 days because you find out about it because it's happened.
So I mean, like Apple fixed this as soon as they found out about this. Like they were pissed. I mean, they, you know, they're suing these guys, like, you know, but they patched it, and that specific patch solved the problem, but not before.
So people who say this system is unhackable, Apple found out about it, the Germans found out about it during World War II. Your assumptions about the safety of your system might be wrong. Your opponents might be more clever than you, or might be more resourceful than you think.
There are white hat hackers. Those are like the good guys who look around for exploits, and then they find them, and then they tell the good guys. And then there are black hat ones. You know, we know about. We know Russia's totally into this. So it's you know, whether you believe in election interference in the United States or not, the Russians have an interest in this kind of stuff, and so does the United States. They have Stuxnet,
right? That was like a U.S.-Israeli attack on the
that's exactly
Iranian.
what it was. A cyber weapon. It was a worm, and it may still be in service basically, but it was a joint developed, and they've like kind of admitted it, and they kind of haven't, but it took these Iranian nuclear facilities offline. Like there's all sorts of different kind of hacking things out there, and I just find it really naive for anyone to say, sorry, it can't be done.
Well, and also remember, too, I think it's important to realize that not all hacking involves computer systems. There was a great documentary made about how the Russians managed to tamper with the urine collection bottles that the anti-doping agency used to try to keep athletics pure from doping. And the Swiss company had made these bottles that, you know, once you screwed on the top, you couldn't remove it. There was just no way. It was impossible. And yet the Russians figured out how to do it so they could continue doping their athletes. And again, it's like everyone's like, it can't be done. And then next thing you know, it's done.
Yeah. So I guess I would, what I'm getting to, and we can go into way more detail about this if people want us to, but what I'm getting at is that because it hasn't been done is not a reason to say it can't be done. And you've identified these opportunities, these coincidences, this Venn diagram of weirdness, and I don't know if the Atlantic article says it's tell me why this is off the table. I don't get it.
An important point too that I really want to draw a line under in this episode is that the existence of this vulnerability is not an idea that is mine alone. And it's not an idea that I developed alone. And one of the key architects of this idea is Victor Iannello, a member of the independent group, who has been very critical of me on Twitter and so forth. That's fine. He's allowed to disagree with me. But he wrote a paper explaining, actually carrying the ideas further than anyone else ever has. He had the insight that just by changing a single parameter in the satellite data unit, you could make the plane look like it was going south when it was really going north. I hasten to add that Victor does not think that this vulnerability was exploited. In fact, he gets really mad when I talk about the idea that this vulnerability existed and might have.
I would ask him
exploited.
himself, but he doesn't want to come on this thing. But he's saying that and he's very critical about this. That's true. So he said that it's. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's all I can do here. He said that it's possible, but he doesn't think it happened. Is that what you're telling me?
No, he says it's definitely 100%. He says there's a 0% chance that it was exploited. And I think we can talk about that in a separate episode. And I don't want to, this is not a podcast about this vulnerability or the idea that the plane definitely went north instead of south. But I just want to, we're talking about it in this episode, and we'll talk about more, or I should say, we're going to talk about less controversial stuff going forward. I really want to give all listeners and viewers a comprehensive understanding of the evidence in this case and what it means. But what we're introducing in this episode is an alternate lens through which all of the evidence of this case can be looked at. So things that are very coincidental, if you assume that the pilot took it without having any idea about Inmarsat data, then the turning on of the SDU, for instance, is kind of baffling and kind of hard to explain and just sort of a mystery that you have to live with. But if you imagine that there was an exploit, then the turning on of the SDU makes a lot of sense, because it's just somebody who went in, turned the box off, changed the parameters, and turned it back on again. And there's a lot of other things that, as evidence that will emerge, that we'll look at in the future, that make a lot of different, that make one kind of sense one way and a different kind of sense the other way.
Right. So this was almost like a preface to something that we're going to talk about more. But the reason we're doing it this way is so we can explain why vulnerabilities are not a batshit crazy idea, and then we will get into what those vulnerabilities are. You teased it a little bit. There's a whole lot more data, and there's a whole lot more specific detail that we can talk about that starts to reinforce why you think that this was a possibility. But I think that's another episode.
It's interesting. It's interesting, Andy, that when Inmarsat first started looking at the data that they had, they wondered, is somebody pranking us? Has somebody tampered with this evidence? And I asked them why they put that idea aside. And they basically said, well, because we did our analysis and the analysis gave us a clear answer. And so they basically didn't think that anybody was sophisticated enough to pull off an attack that would leave behind data that left a clear picture of where the plane
And they're right
went.
that probably not a lot of people could do it. I mean, it's not a whole bunch of people could kind of pull off that level of sophistication, but I just refuse to accept that nobody could do it, and believing that nobody could do it is the reason that nobody did it.
That's a great point. And when I first started thinking about this idea, I thought, wow, you would have to be almost superhumanly clever to do this. But as the years went by and I did more reading and more research, I realized, and I started to write about the field of electronic warfare, which is a very active field, and like lots of really interesting things are happening with drones, and they're hacking into drones to shoot them down or take them over. But there's this entire industry called electronic warfare, which has to do with messing with other people's systems and other people's signals in a way that confuses them. And it's a very bread and butter approach to alter Doppler signals. You know, if you're flying into someone's territory and their radar is bouncing off of you, you can measure that incoming radar and retransmit it at a different frequency to make it seem like you aren't there or that you're traveling at impossible
Well, I guess
speeds.
you just gave us material for another episode. But
that can be a
and
whole other episode.
Same with
but
asymmetrical warfare. You know, like you don't always understand what the bad guy's up to and why. You know,
Right.
so you know,
Right.
there's a lot to talk about here.
But I think I keep saying there's
There's many important things
I have
here.
a lot of things that seem really important.
Save it.
But
I'm just kidding. Go on.
well, this is not looking too far ahead, but in the Netflix documentary, my idea is discussed, and there's a person from the Australian search agency who says that
Opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one,
Yeah.
which is kind of a mean dig.
Yeah.
But it also just shows that
they have not understood my point at all. They don't even know what I'm talking about. The point of this podcast is to explain to people an idea that is a little bit complicated. Well, it's complicated enough that the Australians who are looking for this plane don't even understand
It's
this
very
idea.
complicated.
But the gist of this idea is that it's not 100% certain that this data wasn't tampered with. We know of a way that it's physically possible for it to be tampered with. So whatever value you want to assign to that possibility, it's not zero.
Well, that's why we're doing this. I mean, you're right. The Netflix documentary, I thought it was really good, but it was 3.5 hours long, and we're on our 10th hour of this, and we're still barely scratching the surface. So again, We're going to make separate episodes of this. I know you have so much more to talk about, and I do too. But what are we going to talk about in episode 11?
TBD. There's so many things to say, and I think I need to process my brain a little bit. You and I will discuss it. There's a bunch of things. I don't want to make a promise that's not going to be true, but there's much. Look, a door has just opened, and we're going to talk about something else. I don't want this to become a conspiracy theory show, but I just want people to know that there's now another lens that we can look at all this data from. So as the authorities go forward, maybe we'll talk about how they decided where exactly to look as they're getting ready.
That's a great segue to the fact that, again, and we're going to say this every episode, but this is a collaborative thing. So there are a whole bunch of ways to interact with us, get in touch with us, not just yell at us on Twitter. So obviously, whatever platform you're watching on, you know this, but you can be watching this on YouTube, you can be watching this on Facebook, you can be listening to it on Apple Podcasts, you can be reading our blog and our Substack discussion and forum at deepdivemh370.com. The point is, we are paying attention to these comments, and we're wrapping them into future recordings, because we record this thing just a few days before it comes out. I mean, now my job is to go sit down and, cobble it all together, but it's great because it's really timely. So again, my philosophy on media through On Milwaukee for the last 25 years is that media is journalism is not a sermon, it's a conversation. I'm sitting in my basement, but we're generally speaking not sitting in our basements, just telling people this is the way it is. This is a two-way discussion. So I would love to hear more through the comments, and the way that happens is by liking, subscribing, following, interacting with us, telling us we're crazy, but then tell us why we're crazy, or asking us to look into something else, and we just very well might do it.
And thank you, by the way, to all the people that have subscribed and liked and commented. We really appreciate your support. It's really exciting for us. I mean, I've been able to rethink about this and dive back into it in a way that is really fun and exciting for me. And it's been really great working with Andy on this. So it's really a project. It's a communal project, and that's really
I'm
exciting.
having a great time.
I mean, to everyone, and thank you to Andy, because you have done incredible
Thanks, Jeff.
work.
I mean, this
really
is definitely part of our real jobs, but this isn't the only thing we do. So it's a lot of squeezing it in on nights and weekends, but it's super fascinating. And if we go somewhere with this, if we continue to go somewhere with this, then I don't know if we're going to change the world, but we're going to try.
We will go someplace with this. We're going to take everyone who sticks with us. Look, we are on a roller coaster ride, and we've just kind of come down the first hill. So there's a lot of twists and turns ahead, and we're excited for you to come along with us on it.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to Deep Dive MH370, Episode 10, The Vulnerability. Check it out next Thursday as we drop the next episode, which will be Episode 11, TBD. We'll catch up with you soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, guys.